You must tell him everything now. He can help us.
There is no need for secrets, my child. The Lord sees all.
I know you must hate me now, but I had to tell you the truth. I couldn't live with a lie anymore.
When Yolade walked down the aisle to marry her husband Tund in the vibrant city of Lagos, she carried in her heart the confident expectation that motherhood would follow almost immediately, as naturally as sunrise follows dawn. She had grown up in a family where fertility was spoken of like a proud inheritance. Her mother had birthed 6 children including a pair of twins, her father himself was a triplet, and family gatherings were filled with cousins, many of whom had twins of their own. In her mind, childbearing was not just possible, it was inevitable. She had guarded her purity fiercely before marriage, believing that obedience and faithfulness would earn her divine reward in the form of a thriving home filled with children's laughter. Yet 5 years after her wedding, her house remained painfully silent. At 30 years old, with her husband nearing 37, the silence had grown heavier than any spoken insult. Each morning she woke with hope, and each night she lay down with disappointment. The walls of her bedroom had become witnesses to her private breakdowns, her whispered prayers turning into tearful accusations directed at heaven. "What have I done wrong?" she would ask between sobs, clutching her pillow as though it could answer her. She fasted, she prayed, she attended church services faithfully, kneeling longer than others, singing louder than her own strength allowed, yet month after month her body betrayed her expectations. The pressure from society crept in quietly, neighbors' newborns, baby dedications at church, subtle comments from relatives asking when they would celebrate her own good news. Though her husband never blamed her and often held her close, assuring her that their time would come, she sensed the unspoken worry in his eyes. She knew he desired a child just as desperately as she did. Sometimes she would sit alone in their living room staring at family portraits, imagining where a baby crib would fit, picturing toys scattered across the tiled floor. On particularly dark days, she locked herself inside her room, refusing food under the excuse of fasting, determined to cry until God responded. The emotional exhaustion gnawed at her confidence. The woman who once believed her fertility was guaranteed now questioned her very worth. She felt as though time itself was mocking her, ticking louder with every passing birthday. Yet beneath her despair remained a fragile thread of hope, hope that someday the silence would be broken, that the shame she felt would transform into celebration. What she did not know was that her desperation would soon place her at a crossroads between faith and folly, between patience and a decision that could change her life forever. The afternoon sun burned fiercely over Lagos when Yolade's phone began to ring, interrupting another long session of silent tears, and when she saw her friend Beezy's name flashing on the screen she hesitated before answering because she knew Beezy would not comfort her with gentle words but with sharp practicality. As expected, the moment she said hello, Beezy's voice carried both concern and impatience, telling her that crying would never solve her problem and reminding her once again about the powerful pastor who had helped many women conceive when medical efforts failed. Yolade had resisted this suggestion for months, holding tightly to the teachings of her own church which warned against jumping from one ministry to another in desperation for miracles, but something inside her had begun to crack under the weight of 5 childless years, and the shame she felt each time a relative asked about babies had grown louder than her pastor's caution. Beezy spoke confidently, claiming the man of God was respected, anointed, and responsible for countless testimonies across the city, and when Yolade's voice trembled with doubt, Beezy lowered her tone and revealed something shocking. She herself had once struggled with childlessness, and it was this very pastor who had changed her story. That revelation shook Yolade's resistance because Beezy now had 4 children, healthy and strong, proof that something had indeed happened. Desperation clouded her judgment as she agreed to visit the pastor that very afternoon. After bathing and dressing modestly, she picked up her car keys and drove through the bustling streets toward Beezy's house, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope, wondering if this could finally be the answer she had been begging heaven for. Together they arrived at the pastor's church, a large modern building painted cream and gold, filled with banners declaring miracles and testimonies. Inside, the air smelled of incense and polished furniture. and they were ushered into the pastor's private office where he welcomed them with a smile that appeared warm but carried something Yolade could not immediately define. He listened as they explained her struggle, nodding knowingly before declaring that her problem was spiritual and that he had already received divine insight concerning her situation. Yolade leaned forward anxiously, expecting prayer instructions or perhaps special fasting guidelines, but what followed made her heart freeze. The pastor calmly stated that from what he had seen spiritually, her husband was unable to impregnate her and that God had chosen him, the pastor, to intervene physically so she could conceive and later attribute the pregnancy to her husband. The words struck her like thunder. For a moment she wondered if she had misunderstood, but his expression remained steady as though he had offered something ordinary. Her body stiffened, and she immediately shook her head, whispering that such a thing was impossible, that she was a married woman who had kept herself pure for her husband. Yet Beezy gently pulled her aside, speaking in hushed tones, confessing that this was exactly how she had conceived her own children and that many respectable women in the city had done the same in secrecy to save their marriages. Yolade's mind raced. Was this truly God's unconventional method, or was it something dangerously wrong? The fear of losing her husband battled against the fear of remaining childless forever. She imagined the relief on Tun's face if she finally became pregnant, imagined the celebration, the restoration of dignity, the end of whispers. The pastor, sensing her hesitation, reassured her that he was merely an instrument of divine will and that she should consider it a holy assignment rather than sin. Confusion swallowed her reasoning, the line between faith and deception blurred under the pressure of longing. She felt cornered by her own desperation, as though standing at the edge of a cliff where either direction promised pain. The silence in the room grew heavy until her resistance weakened, not because she was convinced, but because she was tired of waiting, tired of crying, tired of feeling incomplete. That afternoon, in the quiet privacy of that office, Yolade stood on the brink of a decision that would alter the course of her marriage and test the strength of her conscience, unaware that the solution she was reaching for might carry consequences far greater than the problem she was trying to solve. The small private room behind the pastor's office in Lagos felt strangely suffocating despite the humming air conditioner mounted high on the wall, and as Yolade stood inside it, her heart pounding violently against her chest, she realized she had crossed a line she once believed she would never even approach. Moments earlier she had still been in the main office arguing weakly against the proposal, but Beezy's persistent whispers about saving your marriage and restoring your dignity had pushed her forward until resistance felt more exhausting than surrender. The pastor moved about calmly, speaking in soft, rehearsed tones about divine assignments and spiritual mysteries, presenting the act not as betrayal but as obedience to a higher instruction, and Yolade, trembling, found herself trying to silence the loud voice inside her that screamed this was wrong. She remembered her wedding day, remembered promising loyalty to Tund before God and family, remembered believing that her body belonged to only one man, yet now desperation blurred those sacred vows into fragile memories overshadowed by the aching desire to hold a child of her own. When she hesitated one final time, tears already sliding down her cheeks, the pastor reminded her that many respected women had walked this path successfully and that none of their husbands ever knew. He spoke of miracles as if they were transactions, and of secrecy as if it were wisdom. Yolade's knees felt weak as she sat on the edge of the bed placed awkwardly in the room, her hands gripping the sheets while guilt wrestled with longing inside her chest. She whispered a silent prayer asking God to forgive her if this was wrong but also begging him to let it work if it was truly the only way, and in that moment her fear of remaining barren outweighed her fear of sin. What followed left her heart shattered. She did not feel holy or chosen or blessed, she felt broken, ashamed, and distant from herself, as though she were watching another woman make the mistake while she stood helplessly outside her own body. When it was over, she quickly dressed, avoiding the pastor's satisfied smile, and walked out of the church compound without saying much to Beezy, her face pale and her eyes swollen. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every traffic light seemed to expose her secret, every passerby felt like a silent judge who somehow knew what she had done. Once inside her house, she locked herself in her bedroom and cried until exhaustion overtook her, her tears no longer prayers but regrets. That evening she forced herself to cook dinner and behave normally when Tund returned from work, answering his gentle questions about her day with vague replies about a headache, unable to meet his eyes for too long. He noticed her sadness but chose not to press her, wrapping his arms around her in comfort, unaware that the woman he loved was drowning in a secret that could destroy everything. The next morning she hoped it would end there, that perhaps one encounter would be enough and she would never have to return, but around noon her phone rang and the pastor's name flashed on the screen. His tone was casual, almost playful, as he asked when she would be coming again. Shock tightened her throat as she explained she thought it was a one-time act, but he laughed softly and told her conception did not work that way, that they must continue regularly for months until pregnancy was confirmed. His words carried an unsettling eagerness that made her stomach twist, and she realized this was not a sacred mission but something far more selfish. Yet instead of cutting ties immediately, fear crept back in. What if stopping now meant the sacrifice she had already made would be in vain? She told herself she was already deep in wrongdoing and that perhaps completing the process would at least justify the guilt she felt. Days later she returned, this time wearing makeup she rarely applied, convincing herself that if she was going to sin, she might as well ensure it succeeded. But when she arrived unexpectedly early and overheard sounds from behind the same closed door, she froze, recognizing that she was not unique in this arrangement. The reality hit her with cold clarity. She was one of many. Standing in that office, waiting her turn, she felt a new fear rising, not just of moral failure, but of disease, of manipulation, of being entangled in something far darker than desperation. Still, trapped between shame and hope, she stepped forward once again, unaware that each visit tightened a web around her life that would soon become impossible to escape. Weeks turned into a dangerous routine in Lagos, and what had once shocked Yolade slowly became a secret pattern woven into her afternoons. Though each visit to the pastor's private office left her with a heavier heart than the last, she convinced herself that endurance was necessary, that once pregnancy came she would never return again, and so she silenced her conscience with the promise of future relief. The pastor grew increasingly bold, speaking less about divine instructions and more about timing, biology, and his own experience, revealing through careless words that this was not spiritual intervention but a calculated exploitation of vulnerable women desperate for children. Still, Yolade pressed on, clinging to the single hope that all this shame would at least produce the one thing she desired most. Then, in the second month, her body began to change, subtle nausea in the mornings, an unusual fatigue, a missed cycle that made her heart pound with both terror and excitement. She bought a pregnancy test in secrecy, her hands trembling as she waited in her bathroom, and when the result confirmed what she suspected, she sank to the floor in overwhelming emotion. Tears streamed down her face again, but this time they carried mixed meaning, joy at the long-awaited miracle, fear at the hidden truth behind it, and anxiety about the fragile lie she would now have to maintain. At the hospital, a blood test confirmed the pregnancy officially, and she carried the printed result home like both a trophy and a ticking bomb. That evening she presented the document to her husband Tund, watching his eyes widen as he tore open the envelope and read the words. His shout of joy filled the living room, his laughter echoing against the walls that had once absorbed her sorrow. He lifted her in his arms, thanking God repeatedly, promising to protect her and the baby with everything he had, even offering to reduce his work hours so she would never feel stress again. In that moment, Yolade felt a piercing ache in her chest because she knew the child growing inside her did not belong to the man celebrating so passionately. She smiled outwardly, but inside she felt as though she were standing on fragile glass that could shatter at any second. That night, after the celebration quieted and her husband slept peacefully beside her, she slipped into the bathroom and cried silently, asking herself whether the joy she saw on his face justified the path she had taken. She tried to convince herself that the end result mattered more than the method, that the baby would still bring love into their home, that perhaps God would somehow forgive and rewrite the story. But the peace she longed for did not come. Instead, the next threat arrived swiftly. Her phone rang late at night, and when she answered, the pastor's voice carried a tone she had never heard before, cold, controlled, and demanding. After congratulating her with artificial warmth, he made it clear that pregnancy did not end their connection. She must either continue visiting him or pay him 5 million naira to secure his silence. The words felt like ice water poured over her joy, extinguishing the fragile happiness she had barely begun to hold. She tried to reason with him, reminding him that he had promised it was free, that it was supposedly divine instruction, but he laughed at her innocence and warned her not to underestimate him. When she hung up, her hands shook uncontrollably. She realized she had not secured a miracle but stepped into a trap. The following morning he called again, and she refused to answer, her mind racing with fear of exposure. When she finally gathered courage to message him, pleading for him to leave her alone and threatening to report him, his reply was more horrifying than she imagined. He claimed to have recorded everything from the first day and sent her short video clips as proof. Watching herself on that screen shattered whatever strength she had left. She felt exposed, humiliated, and utterly powerless. The pastor's final message was clear: pay, return, or be destroyed. The sweetness of pregnancy had instantly turned bitter, and Yolade understood that the cost of her desperation was only beginning to reveal itself. The joy that had briefly illuminated Yolade's home in Lagos faded into a shadow of constant anxiety as the pastor's threats became relentless, each notification on her phone sending a sharp wave of panic through her body. Pregnancy had once felt like salvation, but now it felt like a fragile secret balancing on the edge of exposure. After seeing the explicit video clips he sent as proof of his recordings, she realized the depth of the trap she had stepped into. This was not a man of God preserving dignity but a predator who had carefully documented his exploitation, preparing leverage long before she even understood the risk. He reminded her that he possessed dozens of videos and claimed he had her husband's contact information, threatening to release everything if she refused to comply. The demand for 5 million naira echoed in her mind like a drumbeat of doom. She tried to calculate possibilities. Could she secretly borrow money, sell jewelry, invent a business emergency? But she quickly understood that even if she paid him once, the demands would never end. The more she thought, the clearer it became that fear was his strongest weapon, and as long as she trembled, he would continue tightening his grip. Sleepless nights followed. She lay beside her husband Tund, listening to his calm breathing while her own heart raced with terror, imagining the devastation on his face if he ever saw those videos. Yet beneath her fear, something stronger slowly began to rise, a flicker of defiance. She replayed the messages in her mind, remembering how confidently he boasted about other women, how certain he was that his reputation and influence would shield him. The arrogance in his tone ignited anger within her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she considered fighting back instead of hiding. When he called again demanding compliance, she refused to answer, choosing instead to send a firm message stating that she would not pay and would not return, and that if he dared expose her, she would expose him as well. His response was immediate and mocking, insisting that no one would believe her over him, that his congregation adored him, that power and money would protect him while she would be shamed and abandoned. The audacity of his words shook her but also clarified the truth. This was no longer about pregnancy or even blackmail, it was about control. Determined not to be cornered further, she decided to confront him in person one final time, not as a desperate woman but as someone prepared to challenge his dominance. She drove to his church with trembling hands but steady resolve, walking into his office without waiting for permission. When he greeted her with a smug smile, she spoke before fear could silence her, reminding him that the videos incriminated him as much as her, that exposure would destroy his ministry and public image, and that she was no longer intimidated by his threats. For a brief moment, she saw a flicker of irritation cross his face, though he quickly masked it with confidence, repeating that she underestimated his influence and warning her again about consequences. But Yolade's mind was clearer now. She understood that secrecy empowered him, and silence would only deepen her vulnerability. Leaving his office, she realized there was only one way to reclaim control: truth. The decision terrified her because confession meant risking her marriage, risking judgment, risking heartbreak, yet hiding meant living forever under threat. As she drove home, tears blurred her vision, but her resolve strengthened. She would tell Tund everything before the pastor could twist the narrative. She would show him the videos herself, confess her mistake, and face whatever consequences followed. By the time she reached her house, her heart was pounding not from fear of the pastor but from fear of losing the man who had loved her faithfully through 5 barren years. Sitting alone in the living room, hands resting on her growing belly, she whispered a prayer not for a miracle this time but for courage. She understood that lies had created this storm, and only truth could calm it. When she finally heard her husband's car entering the compound, she wiped her tears and prepared to confront the hardest conversation of her life, knowing that within the next hour her marriage would either collapse under betrayal or be rebuilt on painful honesty. When Tund's car engine went silent in the compound of their home in Lagos, Yolade felt as though the entire world had paused to watch what she would do next, her palms damp and her heartbeat echoing louder than the ticking clock on the wall. She had rehearsed the confession 100 times in her mind. Yet as the front door opened and her husband stepped inside with his usual warm smile, the words tangled in her throat. He noticed immediately that something was wrong. Her eyes were red, her posture stiff, her smile forced, and he gently asked if the pregnancy was troubling her, offering once again to take time off work if she needed rest, unaware that the storm she was about to unleash had nothing to do with physical discomfort. Yolade could no longer carry the weight. Tears spilled freely as she asked him to sit down, her voice trembling as she began from the beginning. 5 years of silent pain, the shame, the desperation, Beezy's suggestion, the visit to the pastor, and finally the terrible choice she made believing it was the only way to save their marriage. At first, Tun stared at her as though he had misheard, confusion shifting slowly into disbelief, then into visible heartbreak. When she showed him the videos the pastor had sent, his hands shook so violently he almost dropped the phone. The room that had once echoed with celebration now filled with a suffocating silence, broken only by Yolade's sobs and Tun's heavy breathing as he processed the betrayal. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room, asking how she could think so little of him, how she could assume he would prefer deception over childlessness, how she could allow another man to violate their vows without giving him the chance to face the struggle together. Each question pierced her deeper, yet she did not defend herself. She admitted her weakness, admitted her fear, admitted that she had allowed desperation to blind her judgment. For a long moment he said nothing, his face reflecting a mixture of anger and devastation, but beneath it all was something else, pain not only from her actions, but from realizing how much she had been suffering alone. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but no longer shouting. He said the betrayal wounded him deeply, yet the greater enemy was the predator who had manipulated her vulnerability. Instead of storming out, he surprised her by saying they would face the matter together, not in secrecy but in truth. He insisted they report the pastor to the authorities and expose him before he could harm other women. Yolade looked up in shock, expecting rejection but finding unexpected resolve. The following days were turbulent, conversations with lawyers, visits to the police, statements given with trembling voices, but the evidence she possessed became the pastor's undoing. When news began to spread and investigations uncovered other victims, the powerful image he had built around himself started to crumble, and his congregation was forced to confront a truth they had refused to imagine. The scandal shook the community, yet for Yolade and Tund, the greater battle was rebuilding trust at home. Forgiveness did not come instantly. There were nights of silence, moments of visible hurt, and counseling sessions filled with difficult honesty, but Tun chose not to abandon his wife. He made it clear that while the child might not carry his blood, the marriage could still carry truth if they both committed to healing. Months later, when Yolade held her newborn baby in her arms, the journey that had begun with pride and descended into deception had transformed into a hard-earned lesson about patience, integrity, and the danger of shortcuts. The child's arrival did not erase the past, but it marked a new beginning grounded not in lies, but in accountability. Yolade understood now that desperation can disguise itself as faith and that true strength lies not in hiding mistakes, but in confronting them. Though scars remained, their home was no longer ruled by silence or fear, it was sustained by painful honesty and a renewed commitment to face life's trials together. And in the quiet moments when she rocked her baby to sleep, she often whispered a different kind of prayer, not for miracles, but for wisdom never to trade truth for temporary relief again.